Right now, if your child gets a slight fever, you have an entire safety net standing behind you. A pediatrician on speed dial, children's Tylenol in the cabinet, car seats, safety gates, childproof cabinet locks, vaccination schedules, and an entire industry built around keeping small humans alive and unharmed. Parenting today comes with an enormous amount of built-in protection layered underneath it, most of which you probably don't even consciously register on a daily basis. Now strip all of that away. No medicine, no safe car seat, because there's no car, no hospital to rush to if something goes wrong in the middle of the night. Just you, your child, and an environment absolutely packed with predators, disease, extreme weather, and constant physical danger. That was the reality facing every single parent for the overwhelming majority of human history. So the question worth asking is a pretty serious one. How did early humans actually manage to protect their children well enough that our entire species survived long enough for you to be here reading this right now? Let's dig into it properly. The first thing worth understanding is just how brutal the numbers actually were. For most of human history, child mortality rates were staggeringly high by modern standards. In a lot of ancient and prehistoric populations, it's estimated that somewhere between a third and half of all children didn't survive to adulthood, and in especially harsh environments or difficult periods, that number could be even higher. This wasn't some rare tragic exception. It was, statistically speaking, an ordinary and expected part of raising children for almost the entirety of our species' existence. Parents weren't just occasionally at risk of losing a child. They were, in a very real sense, playing a numbers game against extraordinarily difficult odds every single time they brought a new child into the world. Sitting with that statistic honestly reframes the entire question. Early humans weren't trying to guarantee every child's survival because that simply wasn't a realistic goal given the tools and knowledge available to them. Instead, the actual strategy, whether consciously understood or not, revolved around stacking as many small, practical advantages as possible in favor of survival, while accepting an enormous amount of risk and loss that today would be considered an unthinkable tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale. Let's start with the most basic layer of protection: physical proximity. For most of early human history, infants and young children were kept in near constant physical contact with a caregiver, typically the mother, for a huge portion of the day. This wasn't some deliberate parenting philosophy chosen out of a range of available options. It was close to the only viable method available given the complete absence of cribs, safe enclosed spaces, or any reliable way to leave an infant unsupervised without immediate serious risk. Carrying devices, ranging from simple cloth wraps to more structured carrying tools depending on the specific culture and region, allowed caregivers to keep children physically close while still remaining mobile enough to gather food, complete daily tasks, and stay near the rest of the group for safety. This constant physical closeness served multiple protective purposes simultaneously. It kept infants warm in environments without reliable heating. It allowed for immediate response to distress, whether that meant hunger, illness, or physical danger. And it kept children within the immediate protective range of the group, rather than isolated and vulnerable to predators or environmental hazards. In a world without any of the modern safety infrastructure we take for granted, physical proximity between caregiver and child was, quite literally, one of the most basic and effective survival technologies available. Now let's talk about something that tends to surprise people when they first hear about it: the sheer scale of communal childcare in early human societies, often referred to by researchers using the term alloparenting, meaning caregiving provided by individuals other than the biological parents. Early human groups typically didn't rely on a single set of parents bearing full, isolated responsibility for a child's survival. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, and other members of the broader social group frequently played direct, active roles in watching, feeding, and protecting children, spreading the responsibility and risk across a much wider network of caregivers rather than concentrating it entirely on two individuals. This detail is honestly one of the more important, underappreciated pieces of the whole story because it directly addresses a pretty obvious practical problem. A single mother, on her own, attempting to gather food, avoid predators, and continuously monitor a vulnerable infant simultaneously, faces an enormous, arguably impossible workload. Spreading that responsibility across an entire extended family or community group meant more eyes watching for danger, more hands available to help when something went wrong, and considerably more resilience if any single caregiver became sick, injured, or otherwise unable to provide care temporarily. Some researchers argue that this kind of cooperative, group based childcare was likely one of the most significant factors enabling human children, who require an unusually long period of dependency compared to most other animal species, to survive at all. That dependency detail is worth pausing on for a moment because human children are remarkably helpless for an unusually extended stretch of time compared to the offspring of most other species. A newborn foal can stand and walk within hours of birth. A human infant can't even reliably hold its own head up for months. This extended vulnerability window, stretching across many years before a child becomes capable of meaningfully contributing to their own survival, represents an enormous, sustained investment of protective effort. And it's a strong part of why researchers believe cooperative, group based caregiving became such a deeply embedded feature of human social structure in the first place. A species with children this vulnerable for this long simply couldn't have survived relying purely on isolated individual parental effort. Let's talk about shelter and environmental protection next, because keeping a vulnerable child safe from the elements was a constant, ongoing challenge in a world without climate-controlled housing. Early human shelters, whether caves, simple huts, or other temporary structures, were oriented specifically around protecting the most vulnerable members of the group, including children, from extreme temperatures, precipitation, and dangerous wildlife. Fire played an enormous role here too, serving simultaneously as a heat source, a deterrent against predators, and a gathering point that kept the entire family group, children included, centrally located and easier to monitor and protect throughout the night, historically one of the most dangerous periods given reduced visibility and increased predator activity. It's worth appreciating just how much deliberate thought likely went into positioning sleeping arrangements specifically to protect children within these shelters. Younger, more vulnerable children were often positioned in the safest, most sheltered part of a given living space, physically shielded by the bodies of adults or older children sleeping closer to potential entry points or exposed areas. This wasn't necessarily a conscious, explicitly discussed strategy every single time. In plenty of cases, it likely functioned as an intuitive, almost automatic protective instinct, adults naturally positioning themselves between their children and potential external threats without needing to consciously reason through the logic behind doing so. Now let's talk about something a lot more specific and frankly a little unsettling: how early humans dealt with the constant threat of disease, given that they had absolutely no understanding of germs, viruses, or bacteria. Infant and child mortality from disease was almost certainly one of the single biggest contributors to those staggeringly high child mortality rates mentioned earlier. Without any concept of pathogens, early humans couldn't directly target the actual cause of most childhood illnesses. But they could, and frequently did, develop practical strategies based purely on observed patterns, even without understanding the underlying biological mechanism. Breastfeeding, for instance, wasn't purely a matter of basic nutrition. Modern research has confirmed that breast milk contains antibodies and immune-supporting compounds that provide meaningful protection against a range of infections, particularly critical during the extremely vulnerable early months of an infant's life. Early humans obviously had no understanding of antibodies or immune function, but they would have observed, generation after generation, that breastfed infants tended to fare better than infants who weren't, reinforcing extended breastfeeding as a deeply embedded cultural practice across an enormous range of human societies, entirely independent of any formal scientific understanding of why it actually worked. Isolating visibly sick children from the rest of the group, when practically possible, likely offered some additional protective benefit too, echoing similar patterns of early quarantine behavior that showed up across human history more broadly whenever contagious illness was involved. Early humans didn't need to understand the specific mechanism of disease transmission to notice that keeping distance from an obviously sick individual seemed to reduce the chances of others in the group falling ill shortly afterward. There's a specific piece of material culture worth mentioning here too, because it directly connects to this constant proximity strategy: cradle boards and similar structured carrying devices, found across a wide range of cultures and time periods, some stretching back tens of thousands of years based on archaeological evidence of specialized tools likely used in their construction. These weren't just simple slings improvised on the spot. Some carrying devices show clear evidence of deliberate, careful padding for comfort, structural support to protect a growing infant's spine, and attachment points allowing a caregiver to secure the device firmly while performing other tasks with both hands free. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Engineering thought put into these devices suggests early caregivers were actively problem-solving around infant protection and mobility simultaneously, rather than simply making do with whatever scrap of fabric happened to be available. Some cultures developed specific elevated sleeping or resting platforms specifically designed to keep infants and young children safely off the ground, away from crawling insects, small dangerous creatures, and the general dampness or cold that could pose a risk at ground level inside a shelter. This kind of intentional design, essentially an early ancestor of the modern crib, further reinforces the idea that protecting children wasn't left purely to chance or instinct alone. It involved genuine, deliberate problem solving, passed down and refined across generations, aimed specifically at reducing the everyday risks a small, vulnerable child would otherwise face. Let's shift to a topic that connects directly back to something we've touched on in a previous discussion about ancient medicine: early wound care and injury prevention, specifically as it applied to children. Active, curious young children, especially once mobile, faced constant risk of cuts, falls, burns, and other physical injuries, any of which could become life-threatening in an environment without antiseptics or modern medical intervention. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests early human caregivers developed real, practical skill in treating wounds using available plant-based remedies, some of which, as it happens, carried genuine antimicrobial properties that provided at least some meaningful protective benefit against infection, even without any theoretical understanding of why those particular plants seemed to help. Beyond direct treatment, a huge amount of protective effort likely went into simple environmental modification and supervision, removing or fencing off obvious hazards where practical, keeping sharp tools out of reach when not actively needed, and maintaining close, constant supervision of young, mobile children specifically because the margin for error in this kind of environment was so unforgivingly thin. A single serious injury in a world without modern medical intervention carried a seriously elevated risk of becoming fatal, which meant injury prevention through constant, active supervision functioned as one of the most important, if unglamorous, protective strategies available to early human caregivers. There's also an interesting protective dimension to something that looks, on the surface, purely like play. Anthropological observation of various traditional and indigenous communities suggests that children's play, even in early human societies, frequently mimicked adult survival tasks directly, throwing small objects at targets, practicing simple tool use, mock hunting, or gathering activities, and various forms of physical play that built coordination, strength, and situational awareness relevant to the specific dangers of their environment. This kind of play wasn't purely recreational in the way modern people might assume. It functioned as a low-stakes training ground, allowing children to build seriously useful physical and cognitive skills well before those skills became critical for actual survival, all while still under close supervision within the relative safety of the group's immediate living space. This connects to a broader pattern worth appreciating. A huge amount of what protected early human children wasn't a single dramatic intervention, but rather the steady accumulation of small, everyday practices, carrying methods, sleeping arrangements, dietary choices, supervised play, and gradual skill building, each one modestly reducing risk on its own, but adding up cumulatively into a meaningfully safer environment when combined consistently over the course of a child's development. Now here's an angle worth exploring that tends to surprise people: the specific role that teaching and gradual skill building played in child protection, extending well beyond the early infancy years into childhood more broadly. As children grew old enough to move around independently, protecting them shifted from constant physical monitoring toward active education, teaching children which plants were safe to eat and which were dangerous, which animals posed a threat and which didn't, how to build and maintain fire safely, and how to recognize and respond to a wide range of environmental dangers specific to their particular region and circumstances. This kind of practical education functioned as an absolutely critical, ongoing protective layer, because a child who understood their environment well enough to recognize danger independently required far less constant, direct supervision than one who didn't, freeing up caregivers to handle other essential survival tasks while still maintaining a reasonable level of safety for the child in question. It's a solid example of how child protection in early human societies wasn't purely reactive, responding to threats as they appeared, but also proactive, deliberately building a child's own independent capacity to recognize and avoid danger as early and as thoroughly as possible. Let's talk about something a little more difficult and uncomfortable to sit with, because an honest look at this topic requires acknowledging it directly rather than avoiding it. Given the harsh, often brutal realities and resource constraints many early human societies faced, difficult decisions around child survival sometimes had to be made that would be considered deeply troubling by modern standards. In periods of extreme resource scarcity, some historical and anthropological evidence suggests certain societies occasionally engaged in practices that limited the number of children a family or group could realistically support and protect, reflecting the harsh, unforgiving calculus imposed by extremely harsh, resource-limited environments rather than reflecting any lack of care or attachment toward children on the part of these caregivers. This is a difficult, uncomfortable piece of the overall picture, but it's an honest one, and it underscores just how truly severe the survival pressures facing early human parents actually were, pressures modern parents in developed regions of the world essentially never have to confront in anything close to the same way. Let's pivot back to something a bit more uplifting because it's worth appreciating just how much sheer emotional investment and attachment appears to have existed between early human caregivers and their children based on the archaeological and anthropological evidence available. Burial practices specifically involving children found across a wide range of ancient sites and cultures often show clear evidence of careful, deliberate ritual treatment, sometimes including grave goods, decorative items, or specific burial positioning that closely mirrors the same kind of ritual care given to adult burials within the same culture. This suggests that even in societies dealing with devastatingly high child mortality rates, children were not treated as disposable or emotionally insignificant. Quite the opposite. The emotional weight of losing a child appears to have been recognized, honored, and ritually processed in ways remarkably similar to how modern societies handle grief and loss, even across an enormous span of historical and cultural distance. This detail matters because it pushes back against a tempting but likely inaccurate assumption that because child mortality was so staggeringly common throughout most of human history, parents somehow became emotionally numbed or detached from their children as a kind of psychological defense mechanism against near constant loss. The archaeological evidence doesn't really support that assumption. It suggests instead that early human parents cared just as deeply about their children as parents do today, and simply had to navigate an environment that made protecting that deep attachment enormously, tragically more difficult than it is for the overwhelming majority of parents in developed regions of the world today. Storytelling and oral tradition likely played a meaningful supporting role in all of this too, functioning as an efficient way to transmit safety-critical knowledge without requiring every single child to learn every specific danger through direct, potentially costly personal experience. Stories warning about specific dangerous animals, unsafe terrain, or hazardous plants, passed down and repeated across generations, allowed children to absorb critical survival information in a relatively low-risk setting, sitting around a fire listening, rather than needing to encounter every single hazard firsthand before learning to recognize and avoid it. This kind of cultural knowledge transmission, layered on top of direct hands-on teaching, added yet another protective mechanism to the overall system, one that didn't rely purely on a child's own limited personal experience to build the awareness needed to stay safe. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full picture turns out to be a lot more layered and multifaceted than a simple, single explanation could ever fully capture. Early humans protected their children through constant physical closeness and near continuous physical contact during the earliest, most vulnerable stage of infancy. They spread the enormous burden of caregiving across extended family and community networks, rather than relying purely on isolated individual parents facing an effectively impossible workload alone. They built and maintained shelters and fires specifically oriented around protecting the most vulnerable members of the group. They developed practical, trial and error-based strategies around disease prevention and wound care, even without any formal scientific understanding of the underlying biological mechanisms involved. They gradually shifted protective strategy as children aged, moving from direct physical supervision toward active teaching and skill building, deliberately preparing children to recognize and navigate danger independently. And they did all of this while facing mortality rates that would be considered an absolutely unthinkable catastrophe by modern standards, all while still maintaining deep, genuine emotional attachment and care toward children who, statistically, had a meaningfully uncertain chance of surviving to adulthood in the first place. None of these individual strategies alone would have been sufficient. It was the combination, physical closeness, communal support, environmental protection, accumulated practical medical knowledge, and progressive education working together simultaneously that gave human children even a reasonable chance of surviving long enough to grow up and eventually raise children of their own, continuing the same fundamental pattern across an almost unimaginable number of successive generations. So the next time you watch a parent today casually strap a child into a car seat or reach for a bottle of children's medicine without a second thought, it's worth remembering just how recent and how remarkably fragile that level of safety and security actually is, historically speaking. For the overwhelming majority of human history, keeping a child alive required constant vigilance, an entire community working together, and an enormous amount of accumulated practical wisdom passed down across countless generations, all operating with absolutely no guarantee of success and often against seriously brutal odds that most modern parents will thankfully never have to personally confront. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as fundamental as keeping a child alive required this much accumulated collective effort, this much community wide cooperation, and this much hard won practical knowledge passed down across countless generations, what other parts of modern safety and comfort that feel completely automatic today might actually be resting on a similarly enormous, largely invisible foundation of accumulated human effort and sacrifice?